Good afternoon, students. Welcome to this very important and meaningful program. Our speaker, Herb Murez, has his introduction. I am more of an escapee than a survivor. I got out in 1939. I'm a graduate of Camp Ritchie's Military Intelligence School. I saw some action at the wars and served in the military government of US-occupied Germany. The number of people who have first-person experience is getting smaller quickly. I know of my own experience how bad things can happen. Now, students, you're going to be witnesses to the Holocaust. Without further ado, Mr. Herbert Murez.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. My name is Herbert Murez, as Mr. Meyerhoff has told you. I will tell you what I know about the Holocaust of my own knowledge. I was born July 2nd, 1923 in Vienna, Austria. My parents were middle-class people, had a shoe store, and there was a fair amount of trouble in Austria even beforehand, because the Germans did everything what was then called fifth column work to upset the Austrian government, and they succeeded. And on March, I forgot the exact date, but it was in March of 1938, the German troops marched in. And as I said before, times were kind of rough, and a lot of people thought that, well, it will be better. And so the Austrians were standing along the route by which the German army trucks rolled in, and they cheered and they greeted them very enthusiastically. And I saw that, and I felt quite a bit less enthusiastic than they did, because I knew that we're in for trouble, and so it's turned out. It developed that in school, immediately the teacher or the professor had to rearrange the seating order so that the Jewish students were all segregated in one corner. And so just to get a little bit ahead of myself, by July, or actually by May, it was in May, that all the Jewish students were thrown out of school without being able to even finish the year or get any grades or anything. Just don't come to school anymore. You don't belong. Okay. It became very evident that the persecution methods that had been installed in Germany from 1933 to 1938, they were all immediately introduced in Austria. So what took several years in Germany took a couple of months in Austria. And it was obvious that we had two problems. First of all, there was no future for any Jew in Austria or Germany. So you had to get a place that would let you in, and you had to have a place to be able to get out. The Germans wouldn't let you out so easily, because they had a whole bureaucracy set up with the necessity of cleansing you of any valuables that you may have, so that when you leave, you can take clothes and a few personal papers, but nothing of any real value like jewelry or money or what have you. And about getting in. The world at that point was in economic problems. So most of the countries said, well, we have sympathy for the refugees, but we have an unemployment problem of our own, so we can't let you in. A lot of people just couldn't get in, and my father had relatives that we had to find in the United States, and it took a tremendous amount of correspondence at a time when there was no internet and when you couldn't do these things even by telephone. You just had to wait for the mail to come back and give it back. And my father, as I said, he had relatives, and when the problems arose, he suffered a nervous breakdown, and he was pretty non-functional. So my mother had to attend to everything, and she did marvelously. She is responsible for the immediate family getting out, although a lot of the collateral family, uncles, aunts, cousins, and so forth, never made it, so they got lost in the Holocaust. They were killed. Anyway, I remember my brother and I, we both went to the United States consulate and registered. And that was necessary, and that establishes a quota number and a priority. And to be able to get into the United States and get an immigrant visa, the government required what was commonly referred to as an affidavit. It was an affidavit of support whereby an American citizen and resident who had the financial means to do so signed an undertaking to the US government that the immigrant that was being sponsored would not become a public charge. If he did not work, they'd have to support him. If he became ill, they'd have to pay for his care and so forth. Well, at the same time, as I mentioned at the outset, my parents had a shoe store, and at that time, it was government policy of the Nazi Party to reward some of their, what they called deserving fighters for the annexation of Austria, to let them buy some Jewish property. And the Nazi Party selected such a buyer to buy my parents' shoe store. He paid something like 5% of the real value, not even covering the furniture, much less the merchandise. And that was paid in installments. And those installments were not paid to my parents in hand. They went into a box account, and later on, a levy was laid on this account to wipe it out. So my parents never got a penny out of their whole life's work, savings, and accomplishments. Anyway, that went its way. And I referred to my brother. There were gangs on the street. They were intent on catching a Jew and making him suffer. So one of them caught my brother, and they made him clean the street with a toothbrush. That seemed to have been a favorite method of oppressing and getting after the Jews. And so long as it happened for somebody else, the lowlives enjoyed it. One fine day, since I was not in school, it was my job to run to the various offices and get various papers and receipts and permissions and what have you. It was a very complex requirement. One fine day, I had to go someplace in the midst of the inner city of Austria, an office that was in an old street about the width of their alley. Two cars could not have ever passed each other because it just wasn't wide enough. And normally people were milling about in that street known as the Seitenstättengasse. And I went there in the morning and the street was empty. And by the time I was there was an SS man in black boots and black riding breeches and a black shirt, the SS uniform, and with armband with a swastika on it. I was standing at the entrance, and I knew that something was wrong. So I asked him, "Excuse me, sir, where is this and that kind of an office?" And he did not answer me, but he says, "How old are you?" Well, that didn't make me feel any more secure. I was 14, and I told him, I'm 13. And just as I said 13, somebody called out to him from a window in one of the adjacent houses, and he turned his head. And at that point, I did something without thinking about it. I cannot say that I thought about it, but instinctively, I ran as far and as fast as I could, and I went through streets, narrow streets like this one in the innermost city of Vienna, where the old streets were located. They were several 100 years old. And when I ran out of breath, when I stopped and I turned around, I looked that nobody was following me. I had escaped. I can't say that I did it knowingly or intentionally. It was just my instinct took over. And I made it home. And much later, I found out that the people that the SS men kept there, they were sent to Dachau, a concentration camp. And some of them came back and some of them didn't. It was a pretty bad story. And I will tell you what happened to my parents' store. As I said, the Nazi party had designated someone to buy the store. And my parents had to just get out of there, walk out. And then I got to spend a penny of that money, because when the Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass, happened, which I experienced, as I told you. When that happened, things just went from bad to worse. Anyway, first my brother's quota number came up and mine came about 6 weeks later. And I remember how my mother had packed one suitcase, which was all that I was allowed to take. I had one suitcase with clothes, and there was nothing in it except clothing and toilet articles and things like that had no real monetary value. And she took me to the railway station, and she acted as though I was going on a summer vacation to a camp. She kept a stiff upper lip, just because she knew this was going to be hard on me, so she was going to make it less hard as much as the circumstances allowed. Anyway, I got on the train, and the train went from what used to be Austria through Germany, through the Rhineland, through the border between Germany and Holland, which was then not occupied yet. And I came to the border, and the German guards came in, and they wanted to check my papers. Let me see your papers. So I gave them my papers. And then they wanted to see what I had in my suitcase. And I just dumped everything out. And they said, we'll be back in a while. And I waited, and I waited. And it took 20 minutes for them to come back. And those were the longest 20 minutes I ever experienced in my life. Anyway, they came back and threw the papers at me and said, you're okay to go. So I had to stuff everything back into the suitcase because I had to dump the contents out. And my mother had packed it so neatly it shouldn't get wrinkled. Forget about that. I was all upset. So these things went back into the suitcase, and the train proceeded to Vlissingen, which was a harbor in Holland, from which a ship was leaving. This was arranged, all arranged beforehand by my mother. And the Dutch guards were much nicer. They simply asked, have the Germans viewed your papers? And say, yes. Okay, go ahead. And the train pulled up on the siding from which I could actually walk up to the pier and get onto the ship. And I carried my suitcase, and that ship was the SS Finland, a Dutch flagged ship, and it took 10 days to cross from Holland to New York. And in New York, I stopped at Ellis Island, where I and several other refugees had been disembarked. And the examiner looked at my papers, said they're okay. They just wanted to know if I had tuberculosis. Any health problems? No. So I got off the ship, and I stayed with a couple of distant relatives in New York, and then went by Greyhound bus from New York to Los Angeles. That was a 5-day trip, and I did not stop on the way, and I just slept on the bus. And I picked up, when the bus stopped at bus stops, I picked up something to eat to keep me going. Anyway, I came to Los Angeles, and my Uncle Ted met me at the station. He is the one who gave me the affidavit. And that was on a Friday that I came in. And on the next Monday, Uncle Ted took me down to his factory and said, you go to work here. So I went to work, and I worked in his factory. I was the shipping department. He was making slack suits and other garments. I had to be packed up and had to be delivered to department stores, and also sent off by United Parcel Post and so forth. Anyway, that was my job. And I worked in that job for something like 60 to 70 hours a week. And he paid me $10 a week. And that sounds like very little money that time, but that was a going wage for unskilled labor in those days. And if I hadn't filled the job, there would have been any number of people ready and willing and anxious to take it. So anyway, and out of the $10, it took $5 for room and board. And I was very glad that he did, because this way I was not taking charity. I at least had the feeling that I was paying my own way. And after some time, I took a job in another factory, and I learned how to cut with a garment with a electric knife that has a long blade that goes up and down, and you follow out a marker and you cut a lot of garments at one time. And people were not too anxious to let you do that, because one wrong move would spoil a lot of cloth. So I had to lie and say, yes, I was experienced, and because I had observed how it was done. And that's how I got up. And at this point, I will fast forward. I will leave a lot of things out. We'll fast forward to the Pearl Harbor experience. I remember listening to it on the radio, and at first I didn't believe this was for real. I thought it was a drama, but it was very, very real. And this is, of course, what brought the United States into the war. At first, I was thinking of getting into the Army. At first, they wouldn't take me. They wouldn't have me because I had flat feet and a heart murmur. Those were at the outset of the building of the U.S. Army. These were disqualifying factors. A second time, the same experience. The same. Then, by that time, it had gotten 1944. The third time, it worked. I guess either the flat feet had improved, or the heart murmur was less loud. Anyway, they kept me, and they sent me to the Camp Crowder in Maryland, which was a Signal Corps school. And I was in basic training, and one fine day, the company clerk calls me, "Murez, come on down." So I came on down. "You're going to go down to the courthouse and you're going to be sworn in as a citizen." So an Army truck took me and about 3 other people for the same purpose, drove me down to the courthouse, and we went to be before the judge. The judge says, "Raise your right hand." So I raised my right hand. I swear to, and so forth, and so forth. "Congratulations, you're now an American citizen. Get back to the base. Get back on the truck, get back to the base." And I have my certificate, my naturalization certificate, which shows me in my Army fatigues, all dirty and grumpled, and I'm very proud of that certificate. It is invaluable. That's just no substitute for it. Anyway, shortly after that, I got another call from the company clerk. "Murez, come on down to the office." So I came down. "You're being transferred to Camp Ritchie." Camp Ritchie was the U.S. Army's military intelligence school. And I got on a train. that had a dining car, but no air conditioning. It was so hot that the butter melted. Anyway, got into Baltimore, and the truck picked us up, took us to Camp Ritchie, which is in the western part of Maryland. For a while, I worked in the supply room for a few days, and after that, they sent me to a class. And this was a very, very rigorous academic exercise. You either cut it or you got sent back to a line company, usually the infantry. Anyway, the course at Camp Ritchie was an 8-week course in which you had to learn all about the German government, the German army that was known. And the lectures went on during the day, and in the evening you had to do your homework and study up. And in the morning, when you get back to class again, you had to take an exam that you actually learned what you had to. If you didn't, you just got thrown out and transferred back to the infantry or whatever. Anyway, I went through that course, and there were several specialties in Camp Ritchie. The biggest one was to interrogate German prisoners of war and to get intelligence of value at the moment, so-called battlefield intelligence. What kind of weapons the opposition had, what they were, where were the mines located, were there any tanks, were there any reinforcements, anything you could get out of a prisoner of war. And if you want to know a little more about how this procedure went, there was not too long ago a whole program of 60 Minutes on the CBS in this area, Channel 2, which detailed what Camp Ritchie did. And they also had other specialties, like some people that happened to speak Russian. They had to learn how to work with the Russian army and to be a liaison between what we were doing and what the Russians were doing. And I myself wound up in a class that focused mostly on documents analysis, on captured German army and German government documents that had been captured, and to extract from them anything of strategic value, not so much for the moment, but of the strategic value and what they were doing and what their staff was thinking about. Anyway, so I finished that course. Out of 16 people, 10 of them graduated. The other 6 never made it. Anyway, then I was sent back to a place, a collective place in Baltimore, Maryland, where they collected people to get on a boat. And the boat that I happened to get on, that was just taking another load of people to Europe, was in peacetime the SS Normandy, which is something that the French had built to compete with the Queen Mary. Some of you have may have seen the Queen Mary in Los Angeles Harbor. Well, this boat was of the same size, but of course it had been gutted out, and there were nothing but bunks in it, bunks and bunks, and a minimal toilet facilities, a minimal kitchen and facilities for the crew. And that ship did not travel in a convoy because that ship could outrun any U-boat. We were crossing from Baltimore over to Europe, and I noticed when I stood on the back deck that they had a pattern for zigzagging. So it was not predictable how they would zigzag, but they did zigzag. And that was for, at various times, not longer than 7 minutes, because it was known that it would take a German U-boat 7 minutes to get a fix and to get a torpedo off. And one fine day, I was on the back deck, and I look around and I look at the sun and I look at the time, and I said, "This is strange. We're not going. We're not going east. We're going west." And I asked the crew member, "What's going on?" He says, "There was a U-boat reported, so we had to circle around." Anyway, the ship, I think, was supposed to land in Brighton. Instead, it went into Scotland, which was closer, and because of this U-boat incident, they were short of fuel, and they wanted to get into the first English port that they could get into. Anyway, so then we traveled. My group traveled by English train from Scotland down to Brighton, which is in the south of England and along the English Channel. And during the night, we had to cross the English Channel. And it was the same thing. There was an old tub that was probably already old during the First World War. And again, was all emptied out. It had bunks and bunks at various layers. And there was one little steel ladder that one person could negotiate at one time, where you could get down into the hold and out of the hold. And it was obvious to me that if the ship is attacked, the people in the hold have no way to get out. So I managed to stay out on the deck overnight. And I've never been so cold in my life, but I'm here to talk about it. The ship docked in Le Havre, which had just been liberated by our troops. And then gradually we're getting some more lectures where the war stood. And then as things progressed, the U.S. Army headquarters moved to Paris when Paris had been liberated. And the intelligence people were quartered in a suburb of Paris known as Le Vésinet. And one fine day, while I was just in the morning, the captain came in. "Are you Murez?" "Yes." And the come with me. Well, the captain had orders to take a couple of jeeps, enough rations, and some German speakers along, because General Patton's army had progressed through Bohemia and to Saxony. And in one of the slave labor places, they found what appeared to be plans for something that was unknown and undecipherable to the frontline troops. So they sent a message back to Chafe, somebody who can read German and has some knowledge should take a look at this.
Herb, you have 10 more minutes.
Okay, so we had
Okay.
a wild ride from Paris across the Rhine, a pontoon bridge at the time because the Remagen Bridge had already collapsed, and we got there and we looked at these plans, and I saw the word Flugbahn, which is German for trajectory. And I said to the captain, this has something to do with aviation or rocketry, and we better get this back to Paris. The captain says, I agree, let's go. So the wild ride went back across the way we came back to Paris. And I found out later on that those were in fact plans for the V2 rocket that Germany developed in the dying days of the war, and that they had hoped would turn things around for them, but it was too late. For the sake of humanity, I can say thank you. Well, Germany surrendered, and the military government was established in Germany, and I got into a unit known as the Berlin Document Center that was tasked with analyzing captured German documents. And I need to take a drink. And one of the documents that sticks in my mind that was personally signed by Adolf Hitler himself was the field order for the occupation of the Rhineland. Under the Treaty of Versailles that ended the World War I, Germany was not allowed to put troops into the Rhineland. And to defeat that prohibition, it was 1935. The Germans surreptitiously prepared places where their army will have garrisons in Rhineland cities and one fine day it happened. Well, the field order said, and this is very close to verbatim, if any opposition is encountered from French military forces, you are not to engage in any fights or military action, but to turn back and go back immediately whence you came. When this happened, the French were trying to mobilize, but England wouldn't, and the French weren't going to go along. So Hitler got away with what was actually a bluff. And it taught him, and it demonstrated for him that there was not a will to resist. And this is the lesson that I derived from my time and from my activity. And that is a very important lesson, and I don't know how to emphasize it. When there is evil, someplace. When something is wrong, it has to be resisted. It will not go away by itself. It must be resisted. It's the same way as if some bully in the schoolyard starts bullying somebody around. There has to be resistance. That has to be controlled. And if you look around what goes on in the world today, you will find that evil has to be resisted, and we're trying to do that. There is an inscription on the National Archives in Washington, D.C. What is past is prologue. And that is also a profound truth, that the past will not necessarily repeat itself in the same form, but it will repeat itself. The patterns have a way of repeating unless they're opposed. So with that thought in mind, I will tell you, you each familiarize yourself with what goes on. And if you see that something is wrong, you don't just shrug it off. You let your teacher know, or let the person in authority know, or do whatever is necessary to set correction in motion. It will not go away by itself. You have to make it go away. And well, when I finished my military service, I went back to the United States. I was discharged, and eventually I went to law school, and I became a practicing attorney, and I'm now retired, and I'm glad that I have the opportunity to talk about my own personal experience and to emphasize what I derive from it. Just remember this, what is past is prologue, and evil does not go away by itself. It must be eradicated. It must be opposed. And I think how much time do we have left for any questions?
So we have a few questions already, which we'll get to. But I do want to say something about Camp Ritchie. And you talked about that program. It's the Ritchie Boys on CBS, and it's really a worthwhile to look at, go search for it and read it, because the actions of the Ritchie Boys, including Mr. Murez, actually turned the tide against Hitler in World War II. What they did, so it's special, and to learn from that. Mr. Murez, did you speak English when you came to the United States?
Well, I had some faculty. I didn't speak as well as I did today, of course, but I was able to communicate because I had learned some. At my time in Europe, if you aspired to be even moderately educated, you had to know the language of your country and about 2 or 3 others. So I had a little bit of English in school, or the equivalent of high school, and even before that, we had a tutor come to my home who taught my brother and me how to speak English.
How did it feel seeing a paper signed by Hitler?
Well, it was a very distinctive signature, and I knew there was a piece of history there. I saw several field orders and orders that Hitler had personally signed, and I had to translate them and abstract them so that they could be circulated among the Allied powers for whoever had the interest in it that could get a copy or see it or get a translation of whatever they wanted. That was my task during the military government following the end of the war. Also, the Nazi Party kept their records on file cards about the size roughly of an 8.5 by 11. And in the waning days of the war, those files were dumped in an old abandoned salt mine that had water at the bottom. So they were waterlogged, and we had to have a whole crew to go through them, to re-alphabetize them, and try to reconstruct them as best as possible to know who was active in the Nazi Party and who wasn't. There's one other thing that I remember that is worth mentioning. When our troops liberated Dachau, the concentration camp in Bavaria, there were a lot of survivors and a lot of dead people that had died, that were just lying around. And General Eisenhower wanted to see it. And General Eisenhower, of course, was in charge of all Allied forces in Europe. And a general doesn't travel alone. He travels with his retinue, his adjutants, his guards, and his caretakers and what have you. Anyway, when General, I did not see that personally, but it was told to me by somebody who did, that when General Eisenhower saw what kind of a place it was, he barfed. And the next thing he says, get the photographers and take photographs, because in 75 or 100 years, people won't believe that this sort of thing happened. Let there be proof. And that was very, very forward-looking by later President Eisenhower.